Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about a movie called Straw Dogs. So, this film, really to me, I think the best part about this film is the way that this film ends. There's an escalation to this movie, yeah, but I really like the ending of the movie. Like, yeah, there is a moment where reasonably there is a heartbreaking moment going on in this movie where ultimately uh, I don't like exactly what happens to Amy through some portion of this film, but to be brutally honest, but eventually when going into this film, I like how it ends because reasonably I like David's character, who ultimately is James Marsden in this movie, really towards very much the end. But kind of overall, there are some good moments here too. But there's also moments where it seems like David and Amy are kind of like conflicting with one another, to where it seems like even at some point that they're not seemingly on the same side throughout this entire film. It seems like at some point Amy is just desperate for David to finally say something or put his foot down or to ultimately even just like throw something back at someone's face, which David barely does. But when we get towards the end of this film, we have James Marsden's character that really does get back at these people and viciously takes care of business, if you know what I mean. To where Amy ultimately is kind of taking a back seat to David's escapades and otherwise is just very much wanting to much more protect Jeremy Niles's character. Um, so going into this movie is really just about Amy getting back to her roots, and that ends up blowing up in her face at some point. We have it to where it seems that David is considered to be a pushover within this movie. We have a very much hillbilly esh like sort of Charlie and Norman and Chris uh, and Bick and seemingly others who probably see David as a wussy or a guy that otherwise like isn't really the woman that Amy should have ended up with. They don't really quite understand why she ended up with this guy, and basically these guys, these hillbilly esh like guys, only see David as a city boy that probably won't be able to hack it in this small town. So we start having it to where also we find out that Charlie has some history with Amy. It seems like they were high school sweethearts, but at the end of the day, that relationship didn't work out because Amy went off to have a seemingly TV show career. It seems like that seems to be the only thing that is mentioned really on here that ultimately Amy had done some other things, but reasonably, the TV show, some crime show that she did, was the one thing where she had met David and ultimately had seemingly had a relationship blossom. It seems that David is a writer for movies and shows and such, and but it seems like his approach is much more like to a specific degree of stuff that he does. It's not like he does a horror or action genre, which is normally the big things to probably go into. Ultimately, he's probably much more on a smaller scale, and it seems like he's working on a new piece uh, right now, which ultimately is consistently getting. He's consistently getting writer's block because reasonably uh, he's consistently getting writer's block because ultimately there is something like just kind of blocking his train of thought. Recently, just having some of these hillbillies come into his home and kind of ruin his train of thought, or ultimately, it's just consistently that David is just having problems at his home that is conflicting with him writing. To ultimately, he has to call his his person that is going to eventually do this story. Seemingly, he is going to have to extend trying to get his story out because it's taking longer than he thought it would be. But it seems like every once in a while he's researching, he's investigating, and he's trying to figure out books and stuff like that that he can use to try to get more of this story out. So we have within this small town a bunch of people that tend to go a little bit too far, and I think James Woods' character Tom Hedden is kind of one of those people that, like, he is pushed that if you basically tell him no, there is no no-win scenario for him. There is no answer. And so if anybody like tells him no, he will get to the point of forcing them in some way or another to say yes to him or do whatever he wants, or just escalate things to just be like, no, this is going to happen whether they want it or not, so this is going to happen now. So seemingly at some point we also have some other people of the town that just are you can eventually see that this person is going to cause trouble, and that trouble just ends up in the ways of both David and Amy. We have Jeremy Niles, that seems to be a person that repetitively is not watched over. We ultimately have Jeremy Niles and we ultimately have Daniel Niles, who are brothers, but it seems like Daniel is never watching over Jeremy, and it's consistently that Daniel is, after the fact, going and finding Jeremy, getting into trouble. Where ultimately he's like, "Hey man, like if you keep going at this, like we're just gonna have to do something with you." Like ultimately, Jeremy is consistently going after girls in this town. Ultimately, going after seemingly Janice Hedden, which is ultimately Tom Hedden's daughter, and it seems that it seems like Janice is consistently thinking that this relation or quasi relationship that she is trying to have with Jeremy seems innocent, but it seems like Janice is the one really pushing things, and Jeremy is trying to just trying to avoid trying to avoid everything, but he is also in his own mind thinking that Janice is his girlfriend. Jeremy is thinking that Janice is his girlfriend, uh, and that she loves him and this and that. But we're not really quite 100% sure about this relationship. We're not really sure if Janice really feels this way or otherwise is just doing that just to take off her father, or what is she doing. So, but that is not all the big story of this. The big story is the relationship between Charlie and Amy. Seemingly, these high school sweethearts that it seems like Charlie just ultimately won't stop staring at Amy, and ultimately is calling her Amy Cakes. The kind of terms of endearment or whatever you want to say from a previous relationship, and it's like, dude, like she's with somebody. It's like, don't call her sweetie pie, don't call her honey, don't call her whatever, especially if you find out that she's with somebody. That's like, especially to that guy's face. especially to that guy's face. Um, and ultimately, there's never a time where David actually like corrects him or anything like that. It's he just consistently lets it slide. Ultimately, David is mentioning to Amy, it's like, well, hey, like, what is up with the Charlie guy? It seems like the Amy Cakes guy. Like, what is up with him? So, like, David is probably in the nicest way possible, telling Amy at some point some stuff that is bugging him, and Amy at some points is just kind of like telling him, it's like, well, that's like where we live now. There's little things that people have said. Ultimately, when I'm at this town, there's some stuff that people do in this town, and that's how just they are. Considering David, I guess, is a city boy, um, he has to just kind of live with those or adapt to this different environment that he's in. And ultimately, any time where he thinks anything is out of place, it's like, oh no, that's just the normal thing here. And so, really, it just pushes to escalation within this town to where these people, Amy and David, just no longer fit into this kind of town. Even though reasonably they have their own home, their own place, their own spot, doesn't matter. They're just not welcome in this town. And ultimately, towards the end of this film, they will definitely not be welcome in this town, and ultimately, otherwise, decide probably towards the end of it if they are no longer going to still live there. Uh, or I don't know, maybe David should just eventually be a sheriff after this, and maybe that's the reasonable way of which that this goes into being a way that this movie should have ended, where you had kind of the closure of what happens to these characters, but there wasn't. So the real moment that ultimately ends up kind of having me feel like I should probably say this before we get into spoilers. There is a moment where Charlie comes back to Amy's home and is consistently pushing in to be within her home, getting to the point where he's putting his foot next to the door, and then ultimately wanting to force himself uh, to be with her on the couch, because ultimately Charlie is like, I thought we still had something. I thought that she still wanted me, and there's consistent times where Charlie is pushing to ultimately say, while being with her, let's just say, that ultimately every single time that she was with David's character, that she was thinking about him, ultimately desperately wanting this answer to be yes, or ultimately wanting this answer to ultimately go his way, which it doesn't. And eventually she ends up pushing herself off of him, just be pushed into another man, which is done quasi off screen, and then ultimately that is when that scene concludes. So there is a little bit of there is a bit of points in time when it seems that Amy is being very seductive to these hillbilly like characters, but uh, that doesn't give it any thing of what really happens to Amy eventually within the forced entry, and this guy just kind of pushing into being with her, and that really doesn't justify anything of that scene happening later. It's just these guys who are basically feeling that David isn't man enough, which eventually, towards the end of this movie, man, does he become man enough. So, let's go into spoilers about this movie, because at the end of the day, again, the ending justifies the means of this film. And that's all I have to say about this movie. Really, Straw Dogs, where to go and actually see this. There's not a convenient way to say that you saw this film. Um, and ultimately, I didn't mention where to see that film when I talked about Brothers. But anyways, yeah, Straw Dogs. There's not an easy or convenient way to see it, but ultimately you can probably go into a movie pro or a movie play box and ultimately see the movie eventually. So, I'm going to go into spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about the time to spoil this movie. So, we have it to where in the beginning of this film that reasonably we have Amy and David kind of moving back to Amy's roots. It seems that when they first come to this home, we have it to where Amy is just like, "Are you sure about coming here? Like, it seems a little bit too quiet, or it seems like you're like not really gonna get much done, and this and that." David's like, "No, this is fine." Ultimately, when David eventually does see the house after going to the bar, which ultimately escalates into a very weird and or extravagant like uh, scene. And I'll go back to that in a second. We have James's character looking at this house and like, wow, there's a lot of history here. Wow, this is a fairly old house, and man, do I think I can probably like find and uh, be able to think that I can write something here. So we had a bar scene where ultimately Amy is like, yeah, this is the best part of this town. This is the best food. This is whatever. So David and Amy are Damien and Amy are just kind of having fun at this bar, and we have it to where it seems like they are having some burger of sorts, and it seems that David gets like a smear of chili all over his face, and Amy's like, "Well, hey, how about I help you wipe that off?" And he's like, "No, I'm going to keep it." Like they're really being cute and they're really being fun, and that's ruffling all the other like redneck-ish like people that have lived there all their life. Um, because again, it's like when you have a bar that or you have a place that's like that really hasn't had like strangers or whatever like that come to their place, like you get a lot of people looking at you funny. Like I went to like some kind of like bar once, and like bizarrely like I went to there with my family or whatever, and we just kind of ate and we just kind of just had fun and whatever, and like everybody was like looking at us weird, like they were like we were like strangers or we were like foreigners to them or whatever. It was weird, and it was just like I guess like really to be at that bar and to have experienced that, it's like okay, so probably at this bar people were looking at them the same way, even though Amy they knew about her and were ultimately asking about her show and stuff like that. Yeah, we all loved your show, we watched it all the time. We ultimately have it to where seemingly Charlie is making his way to meet Amy and to call her Amy Cakes, and ultimately to talk about the show, and ultimately to just uh, kind of talk about their past. To where like David is just kind of like, oh yeah, they're catching up and whatever. Ultimately, David eventually sees somewhere in the bar that he sees the photo with Charlie and Amy, and it seems like they were high school sweethearts. So here's where we have James Woods' character, like, and the recklessness that he otherwise provides in this movie. So we have it to where James Woods, is getting cut off from drinking. Tom, of course, is the, I believe, former head coach of this football team of this place, and really, I guess for this town, like they're big on football, I guess, because a lot of towns usually are. So we have it to where it seems like the coach seemingly gets like as many drinks as he wants just because he's the former head coach and this and that. But it seems like the bartender is pulling him off and telling him like, hey, like you've reached your maximum, like you've reached like you're done. And so, but Todd is like, no, like I want one more drink, like give it to me now. And so bartender's like, no, like if anything, like I'm cutting you off, dot to dot, you're done. And so reasonably, Todd's character will not accept this. Ultimately, to the point he is, uh, to the point of saying, hey. I will get one more drink and I will even pay for because David goes up to the bar and orders a drink as well, and so Todd is ultimately saying, "Hey, like I will buy one drink for me and one drink for my new neighbor here." Like basically saying that anybody in their town is basically their neighbor, and this and that. So we have it to where Todd is just reckless and ultimately just at the point of like sneaking under the bar and basically getting his own drink, and the bartender's like, sure, okay, fine, to the point to where the sheriff has to get into the bar. Ultimately, Laz Alonso, who ultimately I know from the show The Boys, his mother's milk. I'm like, oh my god, Laz is in the show, or Laz is in this movie, good for him. I'm like, this is freaking awesome. I'm like, dude, I know that guy from The Boys. I know him from being Mother's Milk, and I'm so excited that he was in this movie, and I was also so excited that he was a sheriff. It's like, yeah, like, and like I liked that he was in so much of this movie, and I was like, yeah, this is freaking awesome. Like I liked him in The Boys. I'm so excited to remember that he's in this movie. Good for him. So yeah, so we have it to where the sheriff is ultimately like trying to get Tom away from the bar, and ultimately Tom is just like, "Hey, this is all I wanted was one more drink, and then I was gonna call it a day." So recently, it seems that David is eventually asking Charlie, like, "Well, hey, like, if you and your friends know anything about like roofing, if anything, they have a little like barn or a little shed or whatever that seems to need roofing, and so hey, like ultimately if you and your friends need money, I'm willing to pay whoever to get this roofing done." And Charlie's like, well, hey, that sounds great. And ultimately it seems like whatever amount of money that David or Amy would have to pay these people seems like small potatoes to them, and it just seems like, hey, yeah, we're doing a favor to them for having them do this job, and this and that at first, which I'm like, okay, that's kind of a crappy thing to say to these people, um, but I guess, hey, if they don't really have much work to do anyways, I guess it's just like, I guess kind of treat them like as your like as a person that you're employing. So I guess it's like, meh. So pushing on to where ultimately these guys start working, and they start working seemingly at the crack of dawn. To ultimately it wakes both David and Amy up, and ultimately they're just like, what, like, God, why are they awake so early? And Amy's just like, well, no, that's just how it is here. Like probably a lot of people are farmers or early risers or whatever, so that's just how they are in this town. To even more like the end, like David has ended up like writing his script, and you just have somebody just walking on into his home, grabbing a beer, and then ultimately just sitting down next to David, and ultimately asking like, "Hey, like what kind of movies have you done? Like, have you done anything with horror? Have you done anything with action? Like, hey, like what have I seen? What movies have I seen you do?" And ultimately, David's like, "Well, probably nothing." So to the point to where Bick is ultimately just kind of like just taking some fruit and taking some beer and whatever, and just like making this place seemingly his home, and that evidently ruffles the feathers of David. And ultimately, David talks to Charlie and is like, "Well, hey, man, like why, like you just have people just strolling into my home, not even knocking first, and like just taking whatever they want." It's like, and again, like Charlie and his hillbilly ish like friends are just like, dude, this guy's a pushover. So, and we have like Amy who is almost just like telling him, it's like, well, no, that's just how it is here. Well, if you don't like it, then you can just like tell them you don't like it, and they'll listen to you. And ultimately, David's like, dude, they're not gonna listen to me. If anything, I'm a stranger to them. Like, if anything, we have to where eventually, the longer this goes on, we have eventually to where Amy is just uh, jogging around her home, seemingly with just a tank top and shorts and underwear on. And she's just kind of jogging around her place, and eventually Charlie again comes home, or Charlie comes to Amy's home again to do roofing, and they're just slowing down the car and then just watching her just jog, and they're like, yeah. How did David land? How did David land this woman? So we have it to where Amy is ultimately just kind of just kind of doing things around her house, and we kind of hear like cat calls and stuff like that. Yeah, sweet ass and stuff like that. So recently, like these guys are otherwise doing the old school construction, like just like yeah, Amy, Sweden, yeah, and so David is kind of hearing some of that, and he's like, it's like, God, like really, like, so what? Like, so my woman is just kind of like wearing like at least some kind of clothes and whatever, but God. So Amy is just like, God, these guys are oogling me, so I'm gonna tell David about it. And so recently, like David is just like, well, you know what? Like, yeah, they're just ogling you just because you don't have a bra on. It's like, if anything, if you probably just put a bra on, maybe they would like respect you more, which I don't think was a like. I think what he was saying was like the wrong thing to say, but uh, and plus Amy was just like, well, well, I only dress this way with next to nothing on just for you, and so David is like, well, but I've already kind of seen you naked, so like, if anything, like I know what you look like. But it's like, but no, like she's putting in the extra effort for David because ultimately she's like consistently throwing herself at him, and ultimately they are just consistently either having fun moments or ultimately like they're having romantic moments. It seems like Amy is having also nothing better to do at this home because she's just kind of waiting around for David to write something. And even when he is trying to write something, she has nothing better to do just to just go like, "Hey, I'm gonna throw myself at you one more time because I have nothing better to do." Uh, and like that's I think the biggest problem is Amy is just like, well, you would have thought that she would have tried to like reconnect with people, or maybe tried to do some things with some people just to kind of catch up. But ultimately, that's eventually what she tries to do later on, um, by going to some get-togethers or going into some things that it seems that David would know that some of the people like to do around the town. So he's like, "Oh, I guess I'll like have me and Amy come to that, so that way she can feel connected to the or reconnected to this town and have get-togethers and whatever." So we have it to where eventually Amy, out of frustration because David was kind of condescendingly just go like, well, like why do you have to like wear next to nothing when ultimately there's other people that are going to see you wearing next to nothing. And so that's when eventually Amy, of course, like disrobes a little bit before going into the shower, right with having the window open, really at the schmucks, the hillbilly like people that were all oogling and ogling her. So ultimately, she ends up like disrobing her shirt a little bit and showing a little bit of skin, and then shutting the window and then going into her shower. Where ultimately, Charlie is just like, like his mouth is just like just dropped, and he's like, oh my god, like she's doing that for me. Like if anything, like Charlie is just obsessed with, since Amy is back in town, he is just completely and utterly obsessed, thinking that everything that Amy is doing is for him, and it's not. Ultimately, we have Charlie that is assuming that he is going to easily get back with Amy, and that is not the case. So every single time that David is ultimately going out there, there's probably a new problem of sorts, even to the point to where like things are consistently, like this town is consistently getting their ruffles feathered and everything like that with every little thing that they do. At some points, they end up killing David and Amy's cat and having it in the closet for them to find it later. Uh, Really, to the point where they eventually just lock all their doors instead of just inviting everybody into their house. We consistently have these people that are kind of doing this job, and ultimately David is consistently telling them, it's like, well, hey, like sometimes they're taking time off, they're going hunting, or they are going and doing whatever, and to where David is ultimately just telling them like, well, hey, as long as you get the job done, as long as you get the job done, and ultimately it's taking longer than they said that it would take. Ultimately, he said it was like, oh yeah, it'll just take 2 weeks, and so David is just like, well, now it's taking longer than 2 weeks. Like, what's going on? So because we have all these people like lazing about, which ultimately that's what David kind of says. It's like a lot of them are just kind of like twiddling their thumbs, waiting to get paid, and so we really eventually get it to where David and Amy are trying to be part of this town, ultimately going to churches, ultimately getting going to get-togethers, and ultimately seemingly going to uh, things that retie them into this town. And while that is going on, there seems to be at points where these hillbilly like characters or Charlie ends up coming in and just kind of setting David straight about certain things. But also Charlie is consistently asking David, well, hey, how about you have a drink with us? Or hey, how about you go hunting with us? Or hey, how about you come and do this and that with us? Like, hey, how about you like come on? Like, how about you be our friend kind of thing? And David is like, you know what? No, I'm not. I'm really not quite all that interested in ba 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 ba. So we have it to where within this movie that there seems to be ultimately Jeremy Niles, who seems to be not all quite there, and ultimately is consistently, seemingly getting closer to Janice, and ultimately some of the other people in this town, just kind of just talking to Janice, and then ultimately just like seeming very innocent. So, as well as just talking to everybody. But Tom Hedden, who ultimately sees Jeremy Niles even like look at his daughter the wrong way, ultimately pulls him aside to give him the what for. And that's when Amy kind of rushes in to Jeremy's defense and ultimately ends up kind of fighting with Tom about Jeremy, because Jeremy didn't do anything wrong really, but Tom just won't let things go because he's a drunken slob that sadly enough doesn't see doesn't escalates things way too far and doesn't know when to stop at some point. So before that, we have these people all go to church, and it seems like David ends up leaving the church at some point, and Charlie has to go and confront David for leaving. When it seems like the Reverend starts to uh, go into his sermon. Because really, I think David wanted to be in the church for Amy, because Amy, like everybody in the town, was coming to the church. So David just went with Amy to go to this get together. But ultimately, when the Reverend gets to the church part, David leaves. Charlie confronts him and ultimately tells him, like, hey, like, that Reverend worked all week to get that sermon to speak to us about God and this and that. And like ultimately we were naturally to assume that David is a atheist of sorts, and so reasonably he's like, well, like, I don't really believe in that kind of stuff, or I don't really want to hear that kind of stuff. It seems like a bully to me, and this and that. And so, but it seems consistently that Charlie is going to bring up that stuff later on anyways, just to consistently poke at David to see what he does. So, but really we have Charlie that is ultimately just like, well, no, you don't ever leave. Uh, if you're gonna come to this church, you don't ever leave during any part of anyone's sermon. It's like you're gonna listen to the entire thing and this and that, blah blah blah. And so David is like, well, I don't really want to listen to that stuff, but yeah, I remember some portions of the Bible anyways, and here's one thing that ultimately I remember from that is don't cover thy neighbor's wife. Because really, David is noticing that Charlie is seemingly more and more like really desperately wanting to be with Amy, and he's pushing it to an absurd level with the sweet talking and everything like that. So really treating as if David doesn't exist, which that is what is ticking him off. And to the point where David's feathers is getting ruffled yet again, because it's just like Charlie is going out of his way to try to be as close to Amy as possible, and taking as long as he can with this job as possible, so that way he can just be closer to Amy, and at some point probably talk to her at whatever points. So we have it to where eventually it seems that more and more that David and Amy just aren't really happy with the way that this job is going. It's taking too long, and ultimately David is like, you know what? I think I have to like fire these people. Like these people are taking way longer than they said they would, and like recently there's only so many times where like I don't see them doing enough work, or like I'm just seeing them just not do what I like them to do, so I'm just gonna fire them. So we have it to where Charlie, of course, is coming into David's home, and Charlie is kind of divvying out this, like, hey man, like, I'm gonna have to let you go. Like, if anything, like, this work isn't turning out like it was supposed to be. You're taking too long. Ba 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 ba. Charlie eventually is like, well, I just bought brand new things to do this roofing job, and it's going to take $5,000 to be able to fix all the stuff that I bought for. And Dave's like, $5,000. It's like, nah, okay, fine. Like, if anything, like, if it's going to take $5,000 kind of to get rid of you, and, like, then that's what it's going to have to take. Because ultimately, right before this, we have James who is pushed into hunting. Ultimately, to be seemingly hunting, but actually much more seemingly being hunted. Because when James goes along with all these boys, um, it seems that he ends up almost getting shot at some point by one of the people. He realizes that, but it seems like the people said, "Oh no, I wasn't shooting you. I was actually shooting at the buck." And he's like, "Bullshit! Like, dude, you almost shot me." So it seems like eventually David goes all the way out to eventually shoot a buck, and then eventually realizes that there is no one else around that is with him, and they all left him, and basically now he's going to have to hitchhike back to his home. So we ultimately find out when the sheriff goes to David. It seems like David has all the gear and stuff like that to go hunting, but the sheriff is mentioning, yeah, it's not hunting season at all right now. And David's like, oh crap. The sheriff is kind of very easy with everybody, and ultimately he's like, well, hey, like, you didn't go out hunting or whatever out there, did you? And David's like, oh, no, I'm just, like, kind of, like, out here because my buddies just kind of left me. And, yeah, and so sheriff just kind of takes it for what it is, and as if this... But ultimately, the sheriff takes the rifle from him and ultimately just kind of lets him, uh, gives him a ride. So, because the sheriff is very nice, but also it seems that people were calling and telling that David was on the side of the road with a rifle trying to hitchhike, and so that's where the sheriff eventually uh, goes out there to retrieve David. So here's where we push for ultimately, like, David is like, dude, I'm so done with this guy. I'm so done with Charlie. I'm so done with all his hillbilly-ish like friends. And there's a lot of times where ultimately, like, uh you could see that Charlie is making fun of David, just kind of making fun of his car, ultimately just seeing how, like, nice his car is and how souped up it is, and ultimately asking how much it costs and this and that. Like, oh, you rich, lavish person, and you're just piddling, and you're just so, like, above all of us in this small town, which he's not. So ultimately, David fires all the people, and ultimately they get $5,000 of work that they didn't really actually do. And but everybody's psyched about. You can hear in the background all the guys are psyched about getting $5,000 for stuff that they didn't really work on. And so reasonably, we get to the point of we have it to be where Amy wants to go to the football game because that's what everybody else does in this town, and because I'm sure she's probably getting still stir crazy with nothing to do in this town. But when David does come back to his home after Amy does get taken advantage of by Charlie and one of his other friends, let's just say, Charlie is ultimately, like, talking about firing all of her friends, and she's like, okay, well, great, like, how about we just move out of here, how about we just leave, how about we just go back to the city, how about we just whatever. And like David is consistently trying to ask her what is wrong, and like she never mentions it, it never comes up. And I would have thought at some point that she would have finally at some point said something, but she doesn't. uh from what I would have thought, that like the escalation of stuff to happen, I thought that eventually she would have said something, but I guess I remember wrong and she never does. So you have it to where David is firing people, they're going off on their way, and then ultimately you have Amy desperately wanting to just go out, and David is agreeing with her going out to seemingly this football game. It seems like people are getting excited. It seems that Charlie and his friends are making their way to this football game in a very creepy like way, making it sure that they're sitting pretty close to Amy, and she's getting uncomfortable. She's remembering all the stuff that had happened while this football game is going on, and ultimately she is seemingly having like some kind of attack of sorts, or some kind of like stress moments of reflecting on those events. So we have it to where David is like, "Are you okay? What's wrong?" And so ultimately we have it to where Amy is just kind of I'm feeling like really uncomfortable, and David's like, "Well, do you think we should leave? Like, are you okay?" And so Amy just wants to leave, and so reasonably David, of course, is like, "Yeah, let's go, let's leave." So we end up having them leave, and so while they are just kind of like talking things out, we find out that Jeremy during this football game uh, had been met by Janice, and Janice is like, "Hey, Jeremy, you're here!" And ultimately, she tries to grab his hand and ultimately push him into seemingly some locker room, where ultimately she is trying to be intimate with him, and because it seems that she likes him. But again, I'm still just kind of concerned if she is really just doing all this just to get back at her father, or because she is just so like tired of her father. We'll never know that now because of what happens eventually. So Jeremy and Jeremy and Janice are being intimate in this locker room. It's to the point where Janice is like, "You know what? I really want to try something," and we don't figure out what that trying of things is, and this and that. But it seems that eventually Tom, who is eventually just kind of controlling this entire football game, and to this previous assistant coach of his that is now the head coach of this football team, like Todd is basically like telling him all of what to do. He's basically telling him like how to like do every play, do everything. Like he's even like pushing himself onto the field, where the coach is just like, "God, like yeah, yada yada, yeah, like I get it. Like if anything, like I got the field now." And Tom is just like God, like he's gonna run this team into the mud or whatever. So we have we have at some point Charlie watching over this game, because evidently it's the like they of course were football athletes as before, where David is even mentioning that uh, that these guys were straw dogs, that these hillbilly esh like people were straw dogs. They were all football players, and reasonably the when they were at high school, this was like the highlight of their life, and so they were gods at this high school. And basically, once high school was over, basically they squandered all their potential, and now they're just trying to relive their past moments, because they have nothing left to tie themselves onto but their previous success. Um, because their life went nowhere after high school. So we have it to where Todd is eventually like trying to find his daughter. It seems like his daughter is missing, and so immediately Todd is asking any of the cheerleaders where his daughter is, and ultimately they mention that like, well, like I think she went to the bathroom, or I think she saw Jeremy Niles, and so immediately Todd is like, like you know that she shouldn't be with this guy, and so Charlie is scrambling, or Todd is scrambling Charlie to ultimately get to Charlie and mention, hey, like Charlie, like I think Jeremy has my daughter again, and so really the guys are scrambling together to ultimately try to find Jeremy and or Janice. It seems that Todd gets pretty close to finding Jeremy and Janice, and ultimately we have Jeremy trying to hold his mouth over Janice to have her be quiet and have her not say anything. But the only problem is that he's holding her so tightly, and he's holding her to the point of her losing air, to the point where it's close to her seemingly losing breath or not being able to breathe again. And so ultimately she probably died in Jeremy's arms without Jeremy's real knowledge. And so nobody ever really found her body, and so Jeremy is just kind of walking around seemingly anywhere in the middle of the street, um, because he doesn't know any better, to where when David and Amy are making their way back home, they end up hitting Jeremy by accident because they couldn't see him, ultimately finding out that Jeremy had probably broken his arm, or just had a bone coming out of his arm, and so reasonably David is telling Amy that they're gonna bring Jeremy back to their house because evidently their house is closer. The thing of it is, because this hospital is like 40 miles away, the thing of it is we don't really have Jamie like being taken care of at all. It seems like they're not really handling his wounds all that well. But it is what it is. So we end up having David call the ambulance to come to his home, and I guess like why not just try to? Well, I guess they maybe couldn't. Their car wasn't good enough to be able to drive all the way to the hospital, an ambulance to there to get him. So we have coincidentally, just Charlie and his gang also have a radio that is hooked on to a 911 call, coincidentally, and reasonably they were all simultaneously in this car location all together to hear this radio call for this ambulance, coincidentally. And so reasonably we have all these people that are all now planning to all go and find uh, this home to ultimately get Jeremy, because Todd is naturally assuming that Jeremy did something with his daughter, but he doesn't know what. Maybe Janice is completely fine. Maybe she's taking a crap. Maybe she's taking very long to take a crap. I don't know, but reasonably, it seems that Todd didn't look hard enough for his daughter regardless. Maybe Jeremy did CPR on Janice. Maybe she's completely fine. But again, maybe Janice is just hiding out from her father. Who knows? But more than likely, she's dead. So going on to here, we have James in the gang, James Woods in the gang, all making their way all to this home, ultimately, seemingly with firearms, seemingly with all kinds of stuff that is bizarrely now in this truck, which makes no sense. But I guess they just had to pull over and go to a shotgun store or whatever. So we have it to where all these people conveniently make it to this house and are demanding for Jeremy's release so they can probably kill him. Or ultimately just like probably torture him to figure out where Janice is, but he'll never give that information out. So David and Amy are like looking at their doors, and ultimately you have Charlie that is knocking at the door and kind of being polite about things. Ultimately just saying, "Hey, give us Jeremy," and David's like, "No, like if anything, I'm waiting for an ambulance to come here. Like I'm gonna have him be in my home. Like I have to take care of him because ultimately, uh, hey, like even though like I caused him being injured, I caused him being hurt, so I have a responsibility to take care of Jamie." So we have it to where that's not the answer that these people wanted to hear. It seems that eventually we have the sheriff arrive, who ultimately had heard this 911 call, and so it seems that eventually the sheriff is really just telling all these guys to go home. It's like, why are you all here? He's trying to keep the peace, but he's only one man. So it seems that the sheriff is talking Todd to leave, to calm down, and ultimately we don't know all the information yet, and ba 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 ba. So we have it to where ultimately we are making our way through this, and the sheriff is eventually just kind of like trying to calm all these people down, and eventually just kind of knocking on the door, and David is ultimately talking to the sheriff, and he's like, "Oh, you're one of them. Ultimately, like you're like gonna do whatever they want." And the sheriff is like, "No, like if anything, if you give me Jeremy, like I will make sure I will take care of him and whatever." Uh, Ultimately, they end up shooting the sheriff in the back, killing him, and so that is when David and Amy are just assuming like these guys are going to try to break into this house. We have to do whatever we can do to protect Jeremy, but also protect ourselves because they are going to kill us. We witnessed a murder already, and they are not going to let us live. So here is the awesome and or cool moment that we get. Freaking Amy is just like, I don't think I can do this. I don't think I can like these people are going to try to kill us, and like you can just see the just you can just see the face of Amy, and she's like, oh my god, she can't even like think of what to do. And David is like, you need to help me. You need to help us stay alive. And Amy is just a mess. And so David is just like, okay, go up to Jeremy's room and just like have your father's gun, because ultimately she grabbed her father's gun, and ultimately he's just like, whoa, like man, this is escalating quickly, because even at some point Amy is wanting to have her father's gun, and David is like, whoa, this is like dude, like you're having a gun in our house, like no, this is crazy. It shouldn't have to escalate like this, but eventually David is like, okay, like get your father's gun, go into Jeremy's room. If anything happens to me, it's like then I'll know you're okay. So we have it to seemingly where people are starting to come in. They are starting to shotgun their way in. They are starting to break through these windows, and here's where the cool parts come in. So we immediately have one person try to break through the window, and ultimately David staples their hands uh, to to this wall, and we have it to where it seems to be that this window, like the pieces of the window are shattered to the point where when this guy was trying to make his way in, uh, David kind of like pulled him into there to where ultimately he staples his hands to the window to where it seems that this guy is otherwise going to get his throat cut by trying to adjust or move or whatever from this window, because we have Chris who is making his way through this window and is going to get his throat cut for his troubles. So pushing us on to seemingly have a James Woods character trying to break through one of the other windows and shotgunning his way uh, through this window. and David's character ultimately is seemingly making a lot of pots with hot water. As well as seemingly these guys are otherwise trying to burn down this house, which is a stupid move because David adjusts with that by throwing water through a sink onto this flaming window. Coincidentally, the only flaming window that they had through this entire house was the one that was right by the kitchen sink, luckily. Uh, could have been worse. Could have been a lot worse. Because evidently they were thinking about smoking them out, which is like, that's not gonna work. Because ultimately, dude, like they're gonna try to stay in there as long as possible. Because ultimately the door was like a steel door, which was the hardest door to ever break into, I guess. So we have it to where James Woods is trying to make his way through the window as well, and James Woods' character is met with some very hot water from off of a stove. Ultimately, it's burning the crap out of Todd's character, ultimately to where like he's incapacitated, and ultimately leading to where seemingly James was going to try to get the shotgun from off of James, but ultimately it goes off and it leaves James's hands burnt. So ultimately he flings the hot water. So pushing on, they just decide because seemingly they are trying to get through and they can't. Every single time someone tries to, it ends up blowing up in their face, literally. Uh, we have it to where David is seemingly trying to make plans by trying to get the bear trap and ultimately trying to make it so that the bear trap would work. And seemingly at some point he's going to use that to do something. So we have it in here where it seems like people are sneaking into windows and it's not working. People are trying to sneak into the house via ladders and that's not working either. To where seemingly eventually they decide to ram the house with their car. And so it seems that David is like, oh crap, well, this is probably the only way they're going to be able to make it in this house is to just consistently just try to ram it. Like there's nothing else that they could try or prevent them from trying to do. So we have it to where they ultimately barrel in through the uh, in through the home. It seems that Charlie is knocked out. It seems that James Woods is the first one out of the car, and ultimately he like here's the thing that kind of baffled me in this movie. So James and Amy have absolutely donut holes worth of zero of knives. They don't have knives. I'm like, why don't they have knives? You would think that would be like the first thing that they would like cut people with or whatever. These people have no one lick of any knives with them. How is it that these people live out in the middle of nowhere and at least don't have a set of steak knives? I don't understand that. But I guess that's just like, well, no, it's not like. Then they would have killed everybody with knives, and that wouldn't have been cool. We actually would have needed them to like do things in a conventional way. So we have it to where James Woods is trying to sneak into the house, and we have James who uh, uses the gun on James Woods to blow off his foot, seemingly. And so James Woods eventually is knocked back to otherwise be shot down by David's character. Ultimately, it seems that Bick is trying to make it out of the car, and ultimately, David is consistently telling Bick to like stay in the car, don't move. Every time that David is looking at something else or looking around the house, Bick is getting closer to him. So we eventually just have it to where David has to also seemingly shoot Bick down, and that's when ultimately we have seemingly Charlie make his way back to being awake and to be seemingly fully being able to do things. So we have it to where ultimately the other hillbilly ash-like person is making his way up to uh, Amy's room, to where ultimately David has to like scramble back into there, and eventually Charlie is awake enough, and he ultimately is making himself up there as well. So we get to where there is this standoff between Charlie and his own friend, and in the end we have it to where this friend of David, ultimately I believe it is Norman, basically saying it's like, well, hey, how about me and Amy have another go? Ultimately having Norman tell David that like, hey, we had our time with her, and so reasonably we have it to where Charlie is just like, hey, let's not do that. If anything, hey, let's not like, no, like this is not what we came here for. We came here for Jeremy, and Norman doesn't really care. It's just like, no, I want what I want, and you can get whatever you like reasonably. Like Todd is dead, or Tom is dead, so who cares about Jeremy anymore? So ultimately we have Charlie, who puts the shotgun by the bed and ultimately is trying to talk Norman down, and Amy ends up firing the shotgun, killing Norman, and to where now we find out that this shotgun is completely empty. And it seems like the other shotgun that is also downstairs, it seems like all the shotguns are all empty. If anything, the only gun that really has bullets is the gun that Amy had. So we eventually have it to where Charlie isn't going to use the gun on David, and he's just going to beat the living crap out of him consistently. And because ultimately he's bitter about David getting his girl, and recently he's just going to start beating the living crap out of him. To the point where he's punching him downstairs repetitiously every single time. David is losing his glasses and consistently getting right back to putting these glasses on every time they get knocked off of him, which I think was such like yeah, like you're gonna keep hitting me, but I'm gonna keep putting my glasses back on, and I'm just gonna keep on taking this, to the point to where like David is just getting knocked all over this house. Like, dude, this guy is probably exhausted out of the numerous, like, the stress of all this, and ultimately having to like just be so in fear this entire time, and this and that, and so. But David is consistently getting right back up, even though Charlie is a huge guy, and so like David is just like taller than David, than Charlie is taller than David reasonably is the big thing. And so reasonably it's just uh like Charlie just has a bigger reach, and just a bigger, just like he's just stronger than David is, sadly enough. So but here's the thing. David is just smarter. David is just craftier. And so reasonably David is putting on his glasses for the last time, and Charlie's like, "Yeah, put on those glasses. I want you to see this coming." And so we have it to where David is just like, "Oh, like yeah, like I've killed you. I've defeated you. I've already won." And so reasonably we have it to where Amy has the shotgun queued up on Charlie, and Charlie turns to talk to Amy, and he's like, how could you pull a gun on me? Like, how could you do this? Like, I thought that, like, we were sweet on one another, Amy Cakes. And he's just so, like, how could you have done this? How could you turn a gun on me? But he ultimately realizes it's like, well, yeah, but that shotgun is ultimately empty anyways. And so that's when we get David, who comes from behind Charlie and ends up putting the bear trap onto Charlie. And Charlie is now bleeding to death with the inability of being able to uh, try to like grab for the gun or anything like that. Like, no, like he is just holding on to this bear trap as he's falling over off to the side and is just now just of course just bleeding to death because he's pretty much like almost has his head almost chopped off. So we eventually seemingly at some point having David look around the house, having a head count like, yeah, I got them all. To the point to where eventually we pull off to have David noticing that his shed or that his barn or whatever is is on blaze. He's looking at everything. His car is on fire. His barn is on fire, and yeah, he's just watching it because that's all it can do. He can just watch it burn because there's not like it would take too long to get anybody out there, and recently the sheriff's dead. So what exactly can they? Much more can they do? So we end this movie with watching David's house burn down, and reasonably yeah, this is what David ends up doing was so yeah to me. I was like watching this whole movie. I was like, yeah, you get him, David. Because ultimately, I was hoping that this was going to be a happy ending. Because a lot of times when you have an outnumbered number of people, usually it ends like the movie The Strangers, where the people just die in the end, anyways. And I like this movie because it has technically a happy ending. Every with the whole exclusion of everything with their houses burning all around them, and that's how the movie just tends to end. So when looking at this movie, I really enjoyed it because of the ending. Reasonably, there was some stuff about this where I was like, there's some back and forth things going on, and there seems to be some intelligent writing here, and that's what I can appreciate about this movie is like some back and forth, like intelligent things going on, or just reasonably like going into a small town, and you have a guy from the big city who ultimately is adjusting to uh, ultimately talking about like Harvard and Yale and stuff like that, where ultimately every single little bit of piece of information is making these small town people hate David's character even more. And that's what I liked about these like small little pieces that we get to find out about these characters. And even the romantic moments where Amy is just throwing herself at David repeatedly just because she's yeah, I want to be with my man, or I ultimately want to just kind of smother him and kiss him like every time I see him. And a lot of times he's even like working out and like doing jump ropes and stuff like that. Uh, to the point where like I don't know. I think recently, just Amy, just when she got here, she just had like nothing to really do, and I think that's when she would probably take a lot out on David, and to where when David isn't actually doing anything um, to resolve things, to where the point where David is stepping up to resolve everything. Uh, I think maybe that's when I was just kind of like, okay, well, why isn't there like a real like resolution to like David and Amy's relationship at the very end of this? And like there isn't closure, there isn't like a resolution. It's just kind of like, well, like he definitely loves her to the point of he killed a bunch of men to protect her, and ultimately he was a man trying to do the right thing. But like, it also never feels like I would have loved to have some kind of interesting backstory about David's character, like maybe like revealed towards the very end of this film, of like something to where it's like, yeah, he can take all five of these guys down because maybe he uh, previously, before just being a writer or just being a whatever, maybe he had some kind of like SEAL training or something like that. Would have been really cool to all of a sudden just be like, oh, this guy's a Rambo and nobody knew about it. But no, this guy is just a writer that I guess has just seen too many uh, movies and whatever and things. And so ultimately, when taking into that, yeah, it's just, I don't know. It was really fascinating. The little kernels of knowledge that we got to learn about these characters. But other than that, I'm gonna call this a wrap. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.